Hey guys, settle here. Tonight we're talking about medieval royal mistresses. Not the romantic kind. Not the soft focus, tragic love kind. The real kind. The kind who didn't just sleep with kings, but quietly rewired kingdoms. The kind who sat in the most dangerous seat in medieval Europe. Not a throne. Not a crown. But the space beside a king who thought he was in control. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Let's talk about the medieval mistress. Because if you grew up with modern ideas of royalty, you probably imagine medieval kings as strong, commanding men with absolute power. Men who ruled with iron. Men who spoke, and the world obeyed. But medieval kings were not that. Medieval kings were fragile. Not physically. Politically. They were always one bad harvest away from rebellion. One angry noble away from a coup. One religious scandal away from humiliation. One failed heir away from civil war. And this meant medieval kings lived in a constant state of paranoia, performance, and emotional hunger. Which is why the role of the royal mistress wasn't a side story. It was a power position. A job. A battlefield. And sometimes, a death sentence. Because being a royal mistress in the medieval world was not like being a girlfriend. You didn't get romance. You didn't get security. You didn't get, "the king really loves me," as a protective shield. You got visibility. And in medieval politics, visibility is the most dangerous thing you can have. Queens were protected by law, ceremony, and religion. A queen had a title. A queen had a marriage contract. A queen had coronation rituals. A queen had legitimacy. A mistress had none of that. A mistress was powerful, but unofficial. And unofficial power is always hated. Because everyone knows it exists, but no one can admit it. Which makes it the perfect breeding ground for resentment. A mistress was the easiest person in the kingdom to blame. If the king raised taxes, it was her fault. If the king insulted a noble, it was her fault. If the king lost a war, it was her fault. If the queen couldn't produce an heir, it was her fault. If the king was weak, it was her fault. The mistress became the kingdom's emotional trash bin. And what makes this even more disturbing is that mistresses didn't need to ask for power to become dangerous. Power found them anyway. Because kings didn't just want sex. They wanted comfort. They wanted someone who felt safe. Someone who wasn't a political negotiation in a dress. Someone who didn't represent a treaty, an alliance, or a foreign threat. A queen was usually chosen for strategy. A mistress was chosen for emotion. And emotion is unpredictable. Emotion makes kings reckless. Emotion makes kings generous. Emotion makes kings obsessive. And obsession is where medieval politics gets ugly. Because once a king becomes emotionally attached, the mistress stops being a private person. She becomes a political lever. A pressure point. A target. And sometimes, a weapon. A medieval king could survive a lot of things. He could survive being hated by nobles. He could survive losing money. He could survive being mocked. He could even survive losing battles, as long as he could spin the story afterward. But there was one thing medieval kings struggled to survive. A reputation for being controlled. Because kings were allowed to be cruel. They were allowed to be foolish. They were allowed to be incompetent. But they were not allowed to be dominated. And a mistress created the perfect rumor. A rumor that said the king wasn't ruling. A woman was. And that rumor was poison. Even if it wasn't true. Even if the king was still making every decision himself. Even if the mistress never spoke in council. even if she never touched a single official document. The mere idea that a king might be emotionally dependent on someone was enough to make everyone uneasy. Because medieval politics didn't just run on laws. It ran on dignity. And dignity was fragile. So the moment a mistress became known, she stopped being a person. She became a symbol. And medieval people treated symbols with the same tenderness they treated enemy fortresses. They attacked them. They tried to destroy them. They tried to erase them. And what makes the medieval mistress so fascinating is that she existed in a strange contradiction. She was powerless on paper, but extremely powerful in reality. A queen could order a servant to bring her wine. A mistress could order a king to destroy someone's life. Not directly. Not with a signature. Not with a decree. But with a whisper. With a mood. With a complaint. With tears. With affection. With silence. With that one look that said, "If you loved me, you wouldn't let him talk to me like that." And kings were often surprisingly easy to influence. Not because they were stupid. But because they were human. And human beings are always vulnerable to the people who make them feel important. Especially when the rest of the world treats them like a political machine. Think about what a king's life looked like. Every conversation was negotiation. Every friendship was suspect. Every gift came with strings. Every compliment was calculated. Every laugh was performed. A king rarely heard the truth. A king rarely relaxed. A king rarely felt safe. And a mistress, in theory, offered something different. Someone who wasn't supposed to want anything. Someone who wasn't supposed to be a threat. Someone who wasn't a foreign princess sent by an enemy kingdom. Someone who didn't arrive with an army of diplomats and relatives. A mistress could be local. Familiar. Emotionally comforting. And this is where medieval courts made a mistake. Because they assumed the mistress was temporary. A weakness. A private indulgence. But medieval kings weren't dating. They were investing. They were rewarding loyalty with land, money, titles, and influence. And once you reward someone publicly, they become part of the system. So the mistress became a court figure. A center of gravity. A person nobles had to flatter. A person bishops had to tolerate. A person officials had to work around. And the queen had to endure. Which is where the real war began. Because medieval queens did not usually fight mistresses with swords. They fought with reputation. With alliances. With pressure. With the slow, cold political skill of someone who understood the court was a cage. And the mistress, despite her influence, was still vulnerable. Because the queen had legitimacy. And legitimacy was the medieval version of armor. A queen could be hated. A queen could be mocked. A queen could even be blamed for disasters. But she could not easily be removed. A mistress could be removed in a single afternoon. And this meant mistresses lived in a state of constant danger. Not the dramatic danger of battle. The quiet danger of court life. The kind of danger where your food tastes slightly strange. Where your servants suddenly stop meeting your eyes. Where your friends stop visiting. Where you realize you have become too visible. Too powerful. Too convenient as an enemy. And medieval courts loved convenient enemies. Because when a kingdom is failing, people need someone to blame. And blaming the king is risky. Blaming God is blasphemy. Blaming nobles is dangerous. Blaming the queen can be politically messy. But blaming a mistress? That is perfect. Because she is powerful enough to be hated. And weak enough to be punished. This is why so many medieval mistresses end up in stories that feel strangely similar. A rise. A period of influence. A court full of resentment. A scandal. And then a fall. Sometimes exile. Sometimes imprisonment. Sometimes a public humiliation. Sometimes a suspicious death. Because the medieval mistress wasn't just living in a love story. She was living inside a political trap. And the trap had one purpose. To absorb all the anger the kingdom couldn't safely aim at the king. Which is why, when you look closely, the medieval mistress is often less a villain. And more a scapegoat with excellent clothing. But not all mistresses were innocent. Some were genuinely ambitious. Some were ruthless. Some understood the system and chose to exploit it. Some played the game better than the nobles. And some, in a way that is both impressive and terrifying, became more powerful than the queens themselves. This is where things get interesting. Because the medieval world didn't have one type of mistress. It had several. There was the mistress who was a quiet favorite. The mistress who was a political partner. The mistress who became a public institution. The mistress who became a religious scandal. The mistress who became a dynasty. And the mistress who became the reason people started sharpening knives. And to understand how dangerous this could get, we need to start with one of the most famous examples. A woman who didn't just become a king's lover. She became the center of English politics. And when she fell, she didn't fall gently. She fell like a building collapsing. And the kingdom shook with her. In England, the medieval mistress did not stay a quiet secret. England, as a general rule, was not good at quiet. English politics tended to behave like a family argument that somehow acquired swords, paperwork, and a priest. And this is why England produced some of the most famous, most hated, and most politically explosive mistresses in medieval Europe. Because English kings didn't just have lovers. They had favorites. They had obsessions. They had women who became symbols. And symbols, in England, had a way of getting people killed. The story we need to start with is not glamorous. It's not romantic. It's not even particularly poetic. It's about a king who became emotionally dependent on one woman so publicly that the kingdom began to treat her as a national emergency. Her name was Alice Purrs. And if you don't recognize it immediately, that's normal. Because history loves talking about kings. History loves talking about queens. History loves talking about battles. But it often forgets the women who didn't wear crowns. Even when those women quietly steered the hands holding them. Alice Purrs became the mistress of King Edward III of England. A king who, for most of his life, was a successful ruler. He won wars. He built prestige. He had the kind of long reign that makes chroniclers feel safe. He also had a queen, Philippa of Hainaut, who was widely respected and politically useful. And then, as Edward grew older, something shifted. Philippa died. The king aged. The court changed. And Alice Purrs moved closer. The thing about an aging king is that the people around him begin to smell opportunity. Not the romantic kind. The political kind. An old king is a weakening structure. He is still powerful, but he is less alert. Less sharp. Less energetic. More dependent. More sentimental. And sentimentality is extremely dangerous in a medieval monarch. Because sentimentality makes you generous. And generosity makes you exploitable. Alice Purrs did not rise by accident. She was not some random woman who wandered into the palace and caught the king's eye like a fairy tale. She was positioned. She was placed. She was part of court life. She understood how proximity worked. She understood how to be present without seeming threatening. She understood how to become necessary. And she succeeded so thoroughly that by the end of Edward III's reign, chroniclers were describing her not as a mistress, but as a force. A political entity. A problem. Alice was accused of influencing royal decisions. She was accused of taking bribes. She was accused of manipulating legal cases. She was accused of using the king's emotional dependence to enrich herself. And the important thing is this. Even if only half of those accusations were true, it didn't matter. Because the kingdom believed them. And belief is more powerful than truth in medieval politics. Alice became a symbol of everything people feared. A woman without legitimacy holding real power. A woman close enough to the king to shape his decisions. A woman who could profit from the suffering of others. A woman who was not restrained by duty. Because queens, for all their power, were bound by expectation. A queen was supposed to be dignified. Religious. Maternal. Symbolic. A mistress was allowed to be greedy. And so greed became her brand. And this is where the story becomes quietly fascinating. Because Alice Purse did something that was almost unheard of. She became publicly visible. Not just whispered about. Not just rumored. She appeared in court. She appeared in public. She appeared in legal settings. She acted like a person who belonged there. And medieval society did not know what to do with that. There is a famous story, recorded by chroniclers, where Alice allegedly sat in the king's place at court, dressed in extravagant clothing, adorned with jewels, acting like she was the center of the kingdom. Even if this story was exaggerated. And it probably was. It reveals something important. People were terrified of the idea. Terrified enough to write it down. Terrified enough to repeat it. Terrified enough to turn it into a warning. Because medieval society could tolerate a mistress as a private indulgence. But it could not tolerate a mistress acting like a queen. That was not just immoral. That was destabilizing. That suggested the rules were breaking. And when the rules break in a medieval kingdom, the nobles begin to panic. Because the nobles are the rules. Their power depends on structure. Their status depends on predictability. Their wealth depends on knowing who to flatter. And Alice Purse made the hierarchy feel unstable. So when Edward III finally died, Alice's protection vanished instantly. This is another pattern of medieval mistresses. Their power is tied to one body. The king's. And when that body dies, the kingdom exhales. Then it turns around and attacks. Because after a king's death, everyone wants to rewrite the last years of his reign. They want to explain decline. They want to blame weakness. They want to protect the image of monarchy. And the easiest way to do that is to say, it wasn't the king. It was her. Alice was dragged into Parliament. She was accused of corruption. She was accused of manipulating the king. She was accused of being the reason the kingdom had suffered. She was punished. Stripped of wealth. Exiled from court. Forbidden from approaching the new king. She was treated like a disease the kingdom had finally cured. And this is where the medieval mistress becomes almost tragic. Because Alice Purse didn't destroy England. England was already struggling. War was expensive. Politics were unstable. The government was messy. The king was aging. The system was creaking. Alice did not invent these problems. She simply became the face of them. The convenient scapegoat. The symbol people could attack without threatening the monarchy itself. And yet, Alice was not powerless. She did not vanish. She fought back. She returned. She regained property. She used legal loopholes. She used allies. She survived. And that survival is what makes her so interesting. Because it reveals the mistress wasn't always a passive victim. Some mistresses understood exactly what they were doing. They knew the danger. They knew the hatred. They knew the risks. And they stepped into the fire anyway. Because the rewards were enormous. Alice Purse wasn't the only English mistress to become a national scandal. But she is one of the clearest examples of what happened when a mistress became too public. Too rich. Too bold. Too close to the machinery of law. Because once a mistress starts influencing courts and judgments, she stops being a lover. She becomes a politician. And medieval society hated female politicians. Especially ones who did not have the legal shield of a crown. But England, being England, would eventually produce a mistress who was even more explosive. A mistress whose existence helped ignite one of the most famous conflicts in medieval English history. A woman whose beauty was treated like a political weapon. A woman whose story was turned into legend. Because it was too scandalous not to be remembered. And to find her. The next thing to understand about medieval royal mistresses is that their influence did not always come from money. Sometimes it came from something far more dangerous. Reputation. Because medieval courts were not only political machines. They were gossip factories. And gossip in a royal court wasn't entertainment. It was a weapon. It shaped alliances. It ruined careers. It started rebellions. It convinced people that a king was weak. And a king who looked weak was a king who became replaceable. So when a mistress became famous for beauty, charm, or public presence, she didn't just become a woman the king loved. She became a rumor the kingdom couldn't stop repeating. And that rumor could be used by anyone. Nobles could use it to undermine the king. Clergy could use it to condemn moral decline. Enemies could use it to paint the kingdom as corrupt. Even ordinary people could use it to explain suffering. Because when life is miserable, people like to believe there's a simple reason. And nothing is simpler than blaming a beautiful woman. England learned this lesson again and again. But to see it clearly, we need to step into a reign where the king himself became the scandal. A king whose personality was so disliked, so unstable, so politically disastrous, that almost everyone around him eventually decided the kingdom would be better off without him. This king was Richard II. And Richard II did not have the standard medieval problem of having one mistress too powerful. Richard II had something more complicated. He had favorites. And in medieval England, favorites were treated the way medieval people treated plague. With panic. With rage. And with the absolute certainty that the king had been bewitched. Because when a king makes decisions nobles hate, nobles rarely admit the king might be making those decisions himself. They prefer to believe someone else is controlling him. It is emotionally easier. It is politically safer. And it is a pattern so old you can almost set a calendar by it. If a king is generous to someone the nobles dislike, he is being manipulated. If a king ignores the nobles' advice, he is being seduced. If a king refuses to punish someone, he is being controlled. It is never the king's fault. It is always the influence. And Richard II's reign became a long, slow demonstration of what happens when a monarch insists on having private loyalties in public. Richard II surrounded himself with people he trusted. And the nobility hated that. They wanted access. They wanted influence. They wanted to be the king's emotional center. Because the person closest to the king controlled the kingdom. So the king's personal relationships were not personal. They were political infrastructure. And if the infrastructure wasn't built around the nobles would tear it down. This is where the medieval mistress fits in. Because while Richard II is remembered more for male favorites, the same logic applied to women across medieval Europe. The king's affection was not harmless. It was a pipeline. A pipeline of gifts. A pipeline of power. A pipeline of appointments. A pipeline of legal protection. And anyone excluded from that pipeline became furious. So when you see a mistress rising, what you're really watching is a shift in court gravity. A new center of influence. A new set of people receiving favors. A new set of people being ignored. And ignored nobles do not stay ignored for long. They rebel. Or they plot. Or they wait. And medieval nobles were excellent at waiting. But England's most famous, beauty scandal, Mistress figure, the one who became almost mythical, comes later. She appears in the late medieval period, when the monarchy is wobbling, the nobility is armed, and the country is beginning to feel like it is slowly tearing itself apart. Her name was Alice Chaucer's granddaughter. And that sentence alone tells you how messy medieval aristocracy gets. Because medieval England was not a clean timeline. It was a tangle. Names repeat. Families intermarry. Mistresses become mothers of dynasties. Illegitimate children become political threats. And the line between private and national crisis becomes thin enough to snap. But before we reach the famous mistresses of the Wars of the Roses era, we need to talk about one of the most important and overlooked truths of medieval royal mistresses. They were not always outsiders. They were often noblewomen. And noblewomen mistresses were far more dangerous than servant mistresses. Because a noble mistress had family, allies, land, influence, a political network. And once a king chose her, he wasn't just choosing a lover. He was choosing a faction. He was choosing a side. This is why some medieval mistresses were treated like invading armies. Because in a way, they were. A noblewoman mistress came with cousins, brothers, uncles, friends, clients, people who expected rewards. And those rewards had to come from somewhere. Usually from the king's treasury. Or from confiscated lands. Or from appointments stolen from other nobles. So every royal mistress created an ecosystem. A mini court within the court. A shadow government built around affection. And shadow governments are terrifying to people who prefer the official one. This is where we meet one of the most notorious royal mistresses in medieval English history. A woman who did not simply become a lover. She became a political disaster. She became a public obsession. She became a scandal so large that it outlived the king. And she did it while wearing expensive clothing, surrounded by jewels, and being blamed for a kingdom's misery. Her name was Alice Purr's successor in spirit, though not directly. Her name was Jane Shore. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because Jane Shore became one of the most famous mistresses in English memory. Not because she ruled. Not because she commanded armies. But because she became the perfect story. The beautiful mistress. The fallen woman. The moral lesson. The political scapegoat. The tragic figure. And, quietly, the survivor. Jane Shore was the mistress of King Edward IV. And Edward IV was not an old king like Edward III. He was not fading. He was not fragile. He was young, charismatic, and physically imposing. He was the kind of king people described as handsome because medieval chroniclers could not resist commenting on a good-looking monarch. Edward IV was also, crucially, a man who enjoyed pleasure. He enjoyed women. He enjoyed indulgence. He enjoyed living like a king in the most literal sense. And this meant he had mistresses. Several. But Jane Shore became the most famous. Not necessarily because she was the most powerful. But because her story was the easiest to turn into a morality play. Jane was not born into the highest nobility. She was the daughter of a merchant. Which already made her suspicious to aristocrats. She married young, to a man she reportedly did not love. The marriage was annulled. And she entered the royal orbit. And once she entered, she stayed. Edward IV favored her. He showered her with gifts. He kept her close. He allowed her access. And access is the true currency of court life. Jane Shore became known not only for beauty, but for charm. And charm is a dangerous thing in medieval politics. Because charm makes people listen. Charm makes people forgive. Charm makes people lower their guard. Chroniclers described her as kind. Interceding for people. Asking the king for mercy. Helping petitioners. Which is fascinating. Because even when a mistress is described positively, she is still described as dangerous. Because the moment she intercedes, she is influencing policy. And influence, in a woman without legitimacy, is treated as unnatural. Jane Shore's role became especially complicated because she existed during the Wars of the Roses. A period where England was basically an argument about who should be king. That occasionally paused to become a massacre. In that environment, every relationship mattered. Every friendship was political. Every lover was a potential threat. And Jane Shore, as a visible royal mistress, became a symbol of Yorkist rule. Which meant that when Edward IV died suddenly, Jane's safety vanished instantly. This is another pattern. Mistresses are protected by the king's heartbeat. When that heartbeat stops, the court turns into a hunting ground. Edward IV died in 1483. And the moment he died, England's political situation collapsed. His heir was a boy, Edward V. A child king. Which meant a regency. Which meant chaos. And chaos always produces predators. The most famous predator in this moment was Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The man who would become Richard III. Richard moved quickly. He seized power. He declared Edward IV's children illegitimate. He imprisoned the young princes. They vanished. History calls them the princes in the tower. And while all of this was happening, Jane Shore was still there. A woman who had been close to the old king. A woman with connections. A woman who had influence. A woman who could become a problem. So Richard III targeted her. Not because she had armies. Not because she had money. But because she was a symbol. And symbols are easier to punish than nobles. Jane Shore was accused of treason. Not the obvious kind. Not, she led an army. Not, she signed a treaty. But the medieval kind. The kind that could be shaped into anything. She was accused of conspiring with enemies. She was accused of using witchcraft. Because of course she was. Medieval men loved accusing women of witchcraft whenever they needed an excuse. And then she was punished publicly. Not executed. That would have made her a martyr. Instead she was humiliated. She was forced to do public penance. Walking through the streets in a thin shift, barefoot, carrying a candle. A spectacle designed to teach everyone a lesson. A lesson about female influence. A lesson about sexuality. A lesson about what happens when a woman becomes too visible. And this is what makes Jane Shore's story so revealing. Because it shows the medieval court's preferred method of controlling mistresses. Not always death. Sometimes shame. Because shame is cheaper. Shame is public. Shame is contagious. Shame discourages other women from stepping into similar roles. And yet, Jane Shore survived. She did not vanish into obscurity. She lived. She married again. She remained in London. She became a figure people remembered. And in a strange way, that survival made her more legendary. Because medieval people expected fallen women to disappear. Jane didn't. And her story lingered. Not because she was a queen. But because she represented something medieval society could not comfortably explain. A woman who had influence without a crown. A woman who navigated disaster and lived. A woman who was punished, humiliated, blamed. And still endured. But Jane Shore is only one example. And she is not the most dangerous type of mistress. The most dangerous type of mistress is not the one who is charming. Not the one who is famous. Not the one who is used as a scapegoat. Not because she had armies. Not because she had money, but because she was a symbol. And symbols are easier to punish than nobles. Jane Shore was accused of treason. Not the obvious kind. Not, she led an army. Not, she signed a treaty. But the medieval kind. The kind that could be shaped into anything. She was accused of conspiring with enemies. She was accused of using witchcraft. Because of course she was. Medieval men loved accusing women of witchcraft whenever they needed an excuse. And then she was punished publicly. Not executed. That would have made her a martyr. Instead she was humiliated. She was forced to do public penance. Walking through the streets in a thin shift, barefoot, carrying a candle. A spectacle designed to teach everyone a lesson. A lesson about female influence. A lesson about sexuality. A lesson about what happens when a woman becomes too visible. And this is what makes Jane Shore's story so revealing. Because it shows the medieval court's preferred method of controlling mistresses. Not always death. Sometimes shame. Because shame is cheaper. Shame is public. Shame is contagious. Shame discourages other women from stepping into similar roles. And yet, Jane Shore survived. She did not vanish into obscurity. She lived. She married again. She remained in London. She became a figure people remembered. And in a strange way, that survival made her more legendary. Because medieval people expected fallen women to disappear. Jane didn't. And her story lingered. Not because she was a queen, but because she represented something medieval society could not comfortably explain. A woman who had influence without a crown. A woman who navigated disaster and lived. A woman who was punished, humiliated, blamed. And still endured. But Jane Shore is only one example. And she is not the most dangerous type of mistress. The most dangerous type of mistress is not the one who is charming. Not the one who is famous. Not the one who is used as a scapegoat. The most dangerous type is the one who produces children. Because once a mistress produces children, she stops being a private scandal. She becomes a dynastic threat. And the moment a mistress's son exists, the court begins to think about succession. About legitimacy. About inheritance. About civil war. And that is when the mistress stops being a woman. And becomes a potential catastrophe. And to see what that looks like, we need to leave England for a moment. Because the most extreme examples of mistress power often come from France. Where kings were very good at having mistresses. And very bad at controlling the consequences. France, unlike England, had a special talent. France could take something already politically dangerous. And turn it into a national institution. This is true for many things. Religion. Bureaucracy. Taxes. And, in a way that is both impressive and horrifying, royal mistresses. Because in medieval France, the king's mistress was not always treated as a private indulgence. Sometimes she was treated as a public presence. A figure everyone knew. A figure everyone watched. A figure who received gifts so extravagant they looked like political appointments. And this is where the medieval mistress begins to evolve into something more complex. In England, a mistress might be punished, humiliated, and discarded. In France, a mistress could become a semi-official part of the monarchy. Not in law. Not in ceremony. But in reality. And reality is what actually runs kingdoms. The French court was massive. It was wealthy. It was layered with noble factions. And it was constantly trying to control one problem that never went away. The king's personal desire. Because medieval kings were expected to be moral. Publicly. They were expected to be defenders of the church. Protectors of virtue. Symbols of Christian order. But they were also men with absolute power and limited self-control. And the church, for all its preaching, understood something very clearly. Kings were not going to behave. So the church tolerated certain scandals. It scolded. It threatened. It occasionally condemned. But it rarely broke the monarchy over sexual behavior. Because the church preferred stability. And stability often meant looking away. Which is why royal mistresses flourished. But France added something extra. France made the mistress political. And to understand how this worked, we need to look at the French royal court as a machine. A king was surrounded by nobles who wanted favor. Bishops who wanted influence. Courtiers who wanted money. Relatives who wanted positions. And all of them understood one thing. The king's attention was limited. You could not all be his favorite. So people competed for proximity. They competed for emotional access. They competed for the king's private moments. Because those private moments were where decisions were made. And the mistress was the person who had the most private moments of all. Which meant she was the most valuable route into the king's mind. This is why French mistresses became so feared. Not because they were seductive. Not because they were beautiful. But because they were gateways. If you could get the mistress to like you, you could get the king to listen. If you offended the mistress, you might find your petitions ignored. Your court case delayed. Your appointment cancelled. Your enemy promoted. And because this power was unofficial, it could not be challenged directly. You could not sue the mistress. You could not accuse her in parliament. You could not drag her into court and demand accountability. You could only whisper. You could only spread rumors. You could only build alliances. You could only wait for the king to tire of her. Or you could attempt something more medieval. You could attempt to remove her. Quietly. Permanently. And France was not shy about this. French courts could be brutal. Not always in open violence. But in slow, suffocating pressure. In poison. In scandal. In exile. In the kind of character assassination that destroyed someone's reputation so completely that even their friends became afraid to speak their name. But the most important difference between France and England is that France produced mistresses who became political symbols on purpose. Women who understood that the role could be used. Women who weren't merely surviving affection. They were managing it. Controlling it. Turning it into a tool. And one of the earliest, most famous examples comes from a period when France was still forming its identity. A period when kings were not yet the smooth, polished monarchs of later centuries. A period when the royal court was still half war camp, half palace. This is where we meet a woman who became so influential that later generations could not decide whether to call her a saint, a witch, or a disaster. Her name was Agnes Sorel. And yes, she's technically late medieval rather than early medieval. But she represents something important. She represents the moment when the French mistress stops being merely tolerated and becomes a public figure. Agnes Sorel was the mistress of Charles VII of France. A king who, frankly, needed help. Charles VII inherited a kingdom in crisis. The 100 Years' War had left France fractured. The English held large territories. The nobility was unstable. The treasury was strained. And Charles himself was not the heroic, confident type. He was cautious. Hesitant. Sometimes depressed. He was not a man who naturally inspired devotion. And then, into this situation, stepped Agnes Sorel. Agnes was not a queen. She was not a princess. She was a lady-in-waiting. Which means she already understood the court. She understood etiquette. She understood politics. She understood the invisible power of proximity. And she became Charles VII's mistress in a way that was not hidden. Not secret. Not whispered. It was known. And this is what made her shocking. Because she was not treated as a shameful indulgence. She was treated as a presence. A favorite. A person who belonged near the king. Agnes Sorel is often described as the first official mistress of France. And that phrase alone tells you everything. Official mistress. A contradiction. A scandal given structure. A private sin made public. And she did not behave like someone ashamed. She dressed extravagantly. She wore jewelry. She displayed wealth. She lived close to the king. She received estates. She received influence. And the court watched with a mixture of fascination and fury. Because here was a woman without a crown behaving like a royal. And she did it openly. Agnes Sorel was blamed for many things. As mistresses often are. But she was also credited for something rare. She seemed to energize the king. Charles VII, under her influence, became more decisive. More confident. More active. He began to reclaim territory. He strengthened the monarchy. He rebuilt the state. And historians have debated for centuries how much of this was Agnes. And how much was simply timing. But the perception mattered. People believed she improved him. They believed she gave him courage. They believed she brought him back to life. And this made her even more dangerous. Because a mistress who makes a king stronger is not merely a scandal. She is a political asset. And political assets create enemies. Agnes had enemies in the court. She had enemies among the nobility. She had enemies among clergy who saw her as a symbol of corruption. And she had enemies among women who resented her position. Because the mistress, by existing publicly, undermined the queen. And Charles VII had a queen. Marie of Anjou. A woman who was politically useful, dutiful, and quietly sidelined. This is another cruelty of medieval monarchy. The queen could be loyal for decades. And still become invisible the moment the king found emotional excitement elsewhere. Agnes Sorel's public role humiliated the queen. It also humiliated the nobility. Because nobles did not like seeing a king's attention monopolized by one person. It made them feel locked out. And locked out nobles become aggressive. But the most disturbing part of Agnes Sorel's story is how it ends. She died suddenly. Young. In 1450. And her death has never stopped being suspicious. Because she was pregnant at the time. Because she was healthy. Because she was influential. Because she had enemies. And because the medieval court had a habit of solving problems in quiet ways. For centuries, people whispered that Agnes was poisoned. That someone finally removed her. And modern analysis has suggested high levels of mercury in her remains. Which could mean poison. Or could mean medicine. Because mercury was used in medieval treatments. Especially for parasites and skin conditions. Which means Agnes's death remains, fittingly, unclear. But what matters is the pattern. A mistress becomes too powerful. Too visible. Too politically significant. And then she dies suddenly. And everyone looks away. And the king mourns. And the court moves on. Because medieval courts were excellent at moving on. Agnes Sorel's legacy was enormous. Not because she ruled France. But because she normalized the idea that the king's mistress could be public. That she could have estates. That she could have influence. That she could be treated as a semi-official figure. And once you normalize something, you make it repeatable. And France repeated it. Again and again. For centuries. The mistress became an expected part of the royal ecosystem. A role. A position. A predictable scandal. And as the role became more established, it became more dangerous. Because once a mistress is treated like an institution, her children become even more dangerous. Because her children are no longer just illegitimate accidents. They are political facts. They are acknowledged. They are given titles. They are married into noble families. They become pieces on the chessboard. And this is where medieval mistresses begin to reshape dynasties. Not by seduction. Not by scandal. But by blood. Because the medieval world could forgive a king for having a mistress. But it could not always forgive him for loving her children. And French kings, like many kings, had a habit of doing exactly that. They had a habit of rewarding illegitimate sons. Giving them land. Giving them offices. Giving them wealth. And in doing so, they created rival power centers. Because nobles might tolerate a mistress. But they did not tolerate a bastard being treated like a prince. That was a line. And when that line was crossed, kingdoms bled. And to see the full consequences, we need to look at what happens when illegitimate royal children begin to matter. When they begin to receive real authority. When they begin to threaten succession. When they begin to attract factions. When they begin to make legitimate heirs nervous. Because that is when the mistress stops being a scandal. And becomes the beginning of a civil war. And one of the most dramatic examples of this comes not from France, but from the kingdom where illegitimacy and succession were practically a national sport. Castile. Medieval Castile was not a kingdom that enjoyed calm. It was a kingdom that lived in a permanent state of tension. Tension with neighboring Christian kingdoms. Tension with Muslim territories. Tension with nobles. Tension inside the royal family itself. And when a kingdom already lives with tension, a royal mistress doesn't arrive as a scandal. She arrives as a spark. Because in Castile, kings were not just kings. They were war leaders. They were judges. They were landlords of enormous territory. And they were expected to produce heirs. Not just for pride. Not just for dynasty. But for survival. Because a kingdom without a clear heir was a kingdom that invited invasion. And Castile, surrounded by rivals, could not afford uncertainty. So the queen mattered. The royal marriage mattered. Legitimacy mattered. But at the same time, Castilian kings were notorious for something. They had mistresses openly. They had children with them. They acknowledged those children. And sometimes they loved those children more than the legitimate ones. Which is a perfect recipe for disaster. Because the medieval world could tolerate hypocrisy. But it could not tolerate unclear succession. And Castile became a kingdom where succession was constantly threatened by the king's personal choices. This is where we meet one of the most famous and dangerous figures in medieval Iberian royal life. A mistress who didn't just influence a king. She helped reshape the entire kingdom's politics. Her name was Leonor de Guzman. And her story is one of the clearest examples of why medieval mistresses could become national crises. Leonor de Guzman became the mistress of King Alfonso XI of Castile. And Alfonso XI did not treat her like a secret. He treated her like a partner. A permanent presence. A public figure. And this alone was already a scandal. Because Alfonso XI had a queen. Maria of Portugal. A legitimate wife. A queen with political value. A queen with her own family's power behind her. But Alfonso ignored her. He favored Leonor. He gave her lands. He gave her castles. He gave her titles. He gave her influence. And most dangerously of all, he gave her children. Leonor de Guzman bore Alfonso XI a large number of children. Not one or two. Many. And these children were not hidden. They were acknowledged. They were raised in privilege. They were positioned for power. And suddenly, the queen wasn't just humiliated. She was threatened. Because the queen's son, the legitimate heir, was growing up surrounded by half-brothers. Half-brothers with titles. Half-brothers with supporters. Half-brothers who could become rivals. And half-brothers whose mother was far more powerful than the queen herself. This is the moment when the mistress becomes more than scandal. She becomes the leader of a faction. A faction built not on law, but on blood. Leonore's children became the foundation of a new aristocratic network. They were married into noble families. They were given positions. They were given wealth. They became power centers. And if you were a noble in Castile, you had to make a choice. Do you support the queen and the legitimate heir? Or do you attach yourself to the king's beloved mistress and her sons? Because the king was alive. The king was strong. And while he lived, Leonore's faction was protected. So many nobles chose Leonore. Not out of love. Out of survival. Out of ambition. Out of fear. And the queen, Maria of Portugal, was forced to watch all of this. Year after year. And here is where medieval queens become terrifying. Because queens were trained in patience. Queens were trained in silence. Queens were trained to endure humiliation with a still face. But that does not mean they were powerless. It means they were waiting. And Maria of Portugal waited. She waited through years of being sidelined. She waited through years of watching Leonore rise. She waited through years of seeing Leonore's children become stronger. And she waited for the one moment when everything would change. The king's death. Because when the king dies, the mistress's shield disappears. And the queen's legitimacy becomes a weapon. Alfonso XI died in 1350. And the moment he died, the court's balance flipped. The legitimate heir, Peter I of Castile, became king. And his mother, Maria of Portugal, finally had power. Real power. And she used it immediately. She did not negotiate. She did not forgive. She did not allow Leonore to retreat quietly into a convent. She had Leonore arrested. And then Leonor de Guzman was executed. Not in battle. Not in open rebellion. But as a political cleansing. A removal. A settling of accounts. Maria of Portugal had waited for years to do this. And when the time came, she did it without hesitation. This is one of the harshest truths about medieval royal mistresses. They were protected only as long as the king lived. And kings, despite their power, were mortal. A fever. A wound. A plague outbreak. A bad winter. And suddenly the mistress becomes a prisoner. And if the queen is still alive, the mistress's chances become grim. But Leonore's execution did not end the crisis. It began it. Because Leonore's sons were still alive. They were still powerful. They still had allies. And now they had a reason to hate the new king. Peter I. And Peter I was not the kind of king who solved problems gently. Peter I became known as the Cruel. And whether that nickname is fully fair or partly propaganda, it tells you something. His reign was violent. Unstable. Filled with factional struggle. And the struggle between Peter I and his half-brothers became one of the most destructive conflicts in Castilian history. One of Leonore's sons, Henry of Trastamara, eventually rebelled. He gathered allies. He drew support from nobles who feared Peter. He turned the conflict into a civil war. And in the end, Henry killed Peter. With his own hands, according to many accounts. And Henry became king. Which means something astonishing happened. A mistress's son took the throne. Not as a quiet illegitimate prince. But as the new ruling dynasty. The House of Trastamara. This is the nightmare scenario medieval queens feared. The mistress doesn't just humiliate you. Her bloodline replaces yours. And this is why queens could be so ruthless. Because queens were not protecting their pride. They were protecting their children's future. Their children's survival. And Maria of Portugal understood that Leonor's sons were a threat. Even if Leonor herself was dead. And she was right. Because Leonor's sons didn't just threaten Peter's reign. They ended it. This is why Castile is such a perfect example of how dangerous mistresses could be. In some kingdoms, a mistress was a private scandal. In Castile, a mistress could become the mother of a dynasty. And once that happens, the role of mistress stops being a personal story. It becomes a political earthquake. It also reveals something uncomfortable. Medieval kings often loved their illegitimate children. Not always. But often enough. They gave them opportunities. They gave them power. They gave them pride. And this love was both human and catastrophic. Because love does not care about legitimacy. Love does not care about succession laws. Love does not care about the fragile structure holding a kingdom together. A king could look at his illegitimate son and see strength, charisma, talent. And he could look at his legitimate heir and see weakness. Or resentment. Or awkwardness. And the king's personal feelings could shape the future of an entire country. Which means medieval mistresses were not just romantic figures. They were political risks. They were succession risks. They were civil war risks. And the people who understood this best were not priests. Not nobles. Not chroniclers. It was queens. Queens understood that the mistress was not the real danger. The children were. Because children turn affection into lineage. And lineage is what makes thrones bleed. But Castile wasn't the only place where mistresses created dynastic crises. Portugal had its own. France had its own. Even England, with all its moral outrage, was not immune. Because while England didn't often put bastards on the throne directly, it did allow bastards to become noble houses. And those houses could later become contenders. Which is one of the reasons the Wars of the Roses become so tangled. Because the English monarchy was surrounded by cousins. And half-cousins. And legitimized bastards. All carrying royal blood like a hidden knife. And if you want the most dramatic, Gothic example of a medieval mistress story. One that looks almost like a tragedy written on purpose. We need to go to Portugal. Because Portugal produced one of the most famous love stories in medieval Europe. A love story so intense that it turned into a political crisis. And then into a legend. A story where the mistress did not just become powerful. She became, in a strange way, a queen after death. Her name was Inés de Castro. Inés de Castro is one of those medieval stories that sounds too dramatic to be real. Which is exactly why it is real. Because medieval Europe didn't need fiction. It had courts. And courts were already written like tragedies. Inés de Castro was a noblewoman from Galicia, tied to the powerful Castro family. She arrived in Portugal as a lady-in-waiting to Constanza of Castile, the lawful wife of Prince Pedro of Portugal. So at first, she was supposed to be background. Furniture. A well-born woman placed near a princess for appearances, conversation, and proper courtly companionship. But courtly companionship had a habit of turning into something else. Pedro fell in love with her. Not politely. Not discreetly. Not, this will pass. He fell in love in the way that terrifies governments. Because he didn't treat Inés like a temporary indulgence. He treated her like his real partner. And the Portuguese court saw the problem immediately. Because Pedro was not just a prince. He was the future king. And his marriage to Constanza wasn't romantic. It was political. It tied Portugal to Castile. It balanced alliances. It created stability. And Inés de Castro, threatened all of that. Not because she was evil. Not because she was scheming. But because her existence shifted the gravitational pull of the royal family. And the moment a royal heir's heart shifts, the kingdom begins to shift with it. Pedro's father, King Afonso IV, watched this situation with growing horror. Because Afonso IV had seen enough medieval politics to understand the pattern. A prince takes a mistress. The prince becomes emotionally dependent. The mistress's family gains influence. The mistress bears children. The prince begins favoring those children. The nobility forms factions. And suddenly the kingdom is not stable anymore. It's divided. And Portugal, at the time, was small. It could not afford division. It could not afford internal factional warfare. It could not afford Castile feeling insulted. So Afonso IV tried the usual solutions. He tried separating them. He tried sending Ines away. He tried pressuring Pedro. He tried ordering obedience. But Pedro refused. And the refusal is what turned Ines into a crisis. Because medieval kings could tolerate their sons being sinful. They could tolerate their sons being lustful. They could tolerate their sons having mistresses. What they could not tolerate was defiance. And Pedro's love for Ines became defiance. It became an insult to the authority of the crown. And worse. It became a political danger. Because Ines's family wasn't powerless. Her brothers and relatives were influential in Castile. And if Pedro's love for Ines strengthened that connection, Portugal could end up dragged into Castilian politics. Or even absorbed by it. And for a medieval king, that was not paranoia. That was a realistic nightmare. So the Portuguese court began treating Ines not as a woman, but as a foreign threat. A living diplomatic problem. A walking succession crisis. Afonso IV tried one last time to solve it peacefully. He forced Pedro to accept distance. To keep Ines away. To behave like a prince. And for a time, it worked. Or at least, it looked like it worked. Then Constanza, Pedro's lawful wife, died. And the moment she died, the situation became unbearable. Because now Pedro was free. Free to marry. Free to legitimize Ines. Free to raise her children into royal status. Free to rewrite the future of Portugal. And Pedro made it very clear that this is exactly what he intended to do. Which meant Afonso IV had one final option. The medieval option. The brutal option. The option kings used when they could not control someone's loyalty. Remove the person who held their heart. In 1355, Ines de Castro was executed. She was killed at the order of the king. Not in secret. Not quietly. But as a deliberate political act. And the way she was killed matters. Because medieval executions were often symbolic. They were messages. They were theater. They were the crown reminding everyone that love did not outrank power. Ines was killed while Pedro was away. Because Afonso IV understood something crucial. Pedro might forgive a political defeat. He would not forgive seeing her die. So he chose the safest version of cruelty. He killed her in Pedro's absence. And for a moment. It worked. Ines was gone. The crisis was solved. But Afonso IV underestimated something. He underestimated how much hatred love can become. Because Pedro did not accept it. Pedro did not swallow it. Pedro did not grieve quietly. He turned grief into vengeance. When Pedro became king, he hunted down the men responsible for Ines's death. And he punished them in a way that medieval chroniclers described with horror. They were executed. And according to legend, their hearts were torn out. One from the chest. One from the back. So that they would feel, in death, what Pedro felt in life. Whether every detail is true or exaggerated. Again, it doesn't matter. Because the story became the point. Pedro wanted the kingdom to know. This is what happens when you touch what is mine. And then. Pedro did something so dramatic that it crossed the line from history into myth. He declared that he had secretly married Ines before her death. Which meant, in his eyes, she had been queen. Not mistress. Not lover. Not scandal. Queen. And then came the story that made Ines immortal. Pedro supposedly had Ines's body exhumed. Dressed in royal clothing. Crowned. Placed on a throne. And the nobles were forced to approach her corpse. And kiss her hand. As if she were alive. A dead queen receiving living loyalty. A court forced to perform obedience to a woman they had murdered. This is one of the most famous legends in medieval Europe. And historians debate how literally it happened. But the deeper truth remains. Pedro made Ines politically untouchable after death. He took the one thing the kingdom used against her, her unofficial status. And he reversed it. He turned the mistress into a queen. And he did it in the most terrifying way possible. Not by asking. By forcing the entire court to accept it. And this is why Ines de Castro matters. Because her story shows what happens when a medieval mistress becomes more than a scandal. She becomes a symbol. A symbol of love, yes. But also a symbol of power. Of obsession. Of revenge. And of how medieval monarchy could turn personal emotion into public violence. Ines wasn't powerful because she schemed. Ines was powerful because the future king loved her more than he loved the rules. And the rules, in medieval politics, were everything. That's why the court killed her. Not because she was dangerous alone. But because she changed Pedro. She made him disobedient. She made him emotional. She made him unpredictable. And unpredictability in a monarch is one of the most terrifying things a kingdom can face. So Ines de Castro became the mistress who proved something. That medieval royal mistresses weren't just women in the king's bed. They were women positioned in the fault line of power. And if the fault line cracked, they were the first ones crushed. But sometimes, even crushed women left cracks in the kingdom that never healed. Because Portugal never forgot Ines. She became poetry. She became legend. She became a warning. And she became, in a strange way, the only mistress on this list who achieved something no other mistress could. A crown. Even if it came too late. Even if it came cold. And if Portugal gives us the most haunting mistress story, France gives us the most strategic. Because French mistresses, especially in later medieval and early Renaissance courts, became something different. Not just lovers. Not just scandals. They became official political roles. Almost like ministers. And to see that transformation, we need to step into France, where kings learn to use mistresses as tools. And where women learn to use kings as ladders. In France, especially from the late medieval period into the early Renaissance, something strange happened. The king's mistress stopped being treated like a private embarrassment. And started being treated like a power center. Not officially on paper, of course. Medieval Europe loved pretending everything was moral while doing the opposite. But in practice, everyone at court understood the hierarchy. There was the queen, sacred, official, dynastic. The mistress, useful, influential, dangerously personal. The nobles, jealous, terrified, always watching. And the king, emotionally unstable with a crown. And the moment a king loved one woman more than he respected his court, that woman became a political event. Because she controlled access. She controlled mood. She controlled the private version of the king. And in monarchy, the private version of the king is often the real one. French kings discovered something very early. Queens were for alliances. Mistresses were for loyalty. A queen came with her own family, her own diplomats, her own expectations. A mistress came with no official power. Which meant she could be used without limitations. She was not bound by protocol. She could whisper things the queen couldn't. She could influence decisions without being blamed. And if something went wrong, she could be discarded. Which is why kings liked mistresses. And why courts hated them. Because a queen was predictable. A mistress was not. Not every royal mistress mattered historically. Many were just romance. Or lust. Or boredom. But the dangerous ones, the ones history remembers, they did one specific thing. They built a political faction around themselves. They gathered allies. They arranged marriages. They secured titles for their relatives. They controlled who got appointments. They controlled who got favors. They controlled who got close enough to the king to speak. And once a mistress controlled access to the king, she didn't just have influence. She had leverage. And leverage in medieval France was often worth more than bloodline. If you want the moment where France's royal mistresses evolve into something bigger, you start with Agnes Sorel. She lived in the 1400s, in the court of King Charles VII. And her story is important because she wasn't just a mistress. She was a turning point. Charles VII wasn't known for confidence. He was known for depression, hesitation, and a general vibe of, this kingdom is collapsing and I'm not sure I can stop it. France was exhausted from war. The nobles were fractious. The English were still a threat. And Charles was, not inspiring. Then Agnes appeared. And suddenly the king started acting like a king again. And medieval chroniclers, who hated women having influence, had to admit something they didn't want to admit. She made him better. She encouraged him to rule. To fight. To reclaim authority. To stop being passive. And that's the moment a mistress becomes terrifying. Because the court couldn't dismiss her as a distraction. She was a motivator. A stabilizer. A political engine. And that is unforgivable in a world where only men are supposed to be engines. Agnes was also famous for something else. She was openly visible. She dressed boldly. She wore jewels. She wore styles that scandalized the court. And this wasn't vanity. This was branding. Agnes wasn't hiding. She was announcing. I exist. I matter. And the king wants me seen. That visibility mattered. Because a hidden mistress is shame. A visible mistress is power. And Agnes was visible. So visible that she became a symbol of the king's private world. And that meant she became a target. She died young, possibly of illness. But rumors of poison followed immediately. Because whenever a royal mistress dies conveniently, people start doing math. Agnes Sorel set a precedent. Not officially. But culturally. After her, French kings realized they could have a mistress who wasn't just a lover. They could have a mistress who acted as a gatekeeper. A political ally. A morale booster. A patron of arts. A weapon against noble factions. And the court realized something even worse. Mistresses weren't going away. They were evolving. Here's the thing nobles hated. Queens had rules. Queens had etiquette. Queens had limits. A queen could not openly attack certain nobles. A queen could not easily build a faction without backlash. A queen was expected to behave. But a mistress? A mistress had no official expectations. Which meant she could behave like a man. She could reward allies. Punish enemies. Influence appointments. Arrange property transfers. And do it all through the king's affection. Nobles couldn't fight her directly. Because the king would defend her. And they couldn't fight the king directly. Because, medieval France. So they did what courts always do. They whispered. They spread rumors. They attacked her reputation. They painted her as immoral, corrupt, manipulative, dangerous. Because if you can't attack a woman with weapons, you attack her with language. Now imagine you're the queen. You're lawful. You're crowned. You're sacred. You are literally married to the king in the eyes of God. And yet, your husband is obsessed with another woman. And everyone knows it. And that woman is getting estates, jewels, influence, friends, appointments. And you can't fight her. Because if you fight her, you look jealous. If you ignore her, you look weak. If you complain, you look hysterical. And if you act politically, you look threatening. So queens were trapped. And mistresses knew it. Most people think the queen was the mistress's enemy. Sometimes yes. But the real enemies were the king's advisors. Because advisors wanted control. And mistresses threatened that control. A king's council could argue with him. A mistress could cry. And in medieval politics, crying was sometimes more effective than logic. Not because kings were stupid. But because kings were human. And human rulers are the worst kind. Because they can be manipulated. And then France becomes the blueprint. By the time we reach the later medieval period moving toward the Renaissance, France turns mistresses into something almost formal. Not official in law. But official in practice. Courtiers start behaving like, okay, who is the king sleeping with? Great. That's where power is. And that's when the mistress stops being a scandal. And becomes a political institution. Here's what makes this uncomfortable. Sometimes the mistress was the only person who could calm the king. Sometimes she stabilized him. Sometimes she convinced him to compromise. Sometimes she prevented reckless decisions. Sometimes she encouraged him to govern. Which means, sometimes the kingdom depended on the emotional health of one woman who had no legal authority at all. And that is terrifying. Because it means the crown was not held up by law. It was held up by romance. The one who doesn't just influence the king, but starts influencing the succession. Because once a mistress's children enter the picture, you no longer have a romance. You have a dynastic war waiting to hatch. And that's where we're going next. Because the moment a king begins favoring a mistress's children, the court begins sharpening knives. Not metaphorically. Literally. Medieval courts were obsessed with one thing above all else. Succession. Not morality. Not romance. Not virtue. Succession. Because succession is the only thing standing between a kingdom and a civil war. If the line of inheritance is clean, the nobles behave. If it's messy, nobles start acting like wolves near a wounded animal. And mistresses made succession messy. Not always. But often enough that courts developed a near-paranoid fear of them. Because a mistress could give the king something the queen couldn't. Not love. Kings rarely cared about love. But sons. If a queen didn't produce an heir, or produced weak heirs, or died early, a mistress could fill that gap. And that meant the mistress could become a political solution. Which is the most dangerous thing she could possibly be. Because once she becomes useful, she becomes harder to remove. Here's the core hypocrisy that kept this system running. A king could have as many mistresses as he wanted. That wasn't unusual. But a queen couldn't even look suspicious. If a queen cheated, the entire dynasty became questionable. Because if the queen's child might not be the king's child, The entire line of succession collapses. So queens were kept under surveillance, morally and physically. Meanwhile kings were allowed to behave like a traveling disaster. And mistresses existed in the gap between those rules. They had no legitimacy. But they had proximity. And in monarchy, proximity is a kind of legitimacy. Courtiers didn't fear a mistress because she was seductive. That's the fairy tale version. Courtiers feared her because she was a pipeline. A pipeline through which her relatives could enter power. If the king loved her, he might give her brother a title. He might give her cousin a bishopric. He might give her father land. And suddenly, the mistress's family becomes a faction. A faction tied to the king's emotions. Which means the faction becomes untouchable. And that's how courts get destabilized. Not by romance. By appointments. By property. By influence. Succession. Because succession is the only thing standing between a kingdom and a civil war. If the line of inheritance is clean, the nobles behave. If it's messy, nobles start acting like wolves near a wounded animal. And mistresses made succession messy. Not always. But often enough that courts developed a near-paranoid fear of them. Because a mistress could give the king something the queen couldn't. Not love. Kings rarely cared about love. But sons. If a queen didn't produce an heir, or produced weak heirs, or died early, a mistress could fill that gap. And that meant the mistress could become a political solution. Which is the most dangerous thing she could possibly be. Because once she becomes useful, she becomes harder to remove. Here's the core hypocrisy that kept this system running. A king could have as many mistresses as he wanted. That wasn't unusual. But a queen couldn't even look suspicious. If a queen cheated, the entire dynasty became questionable. Because if the queen's child might not be the king's child, the entire line of succession collapses. So queens were kept under surveillance, morally and physically. Meanwhile kings were allowed to behave like a traveling disaster. And mistresses existed in the gap between those rules. They had no legitimacy. But they had proximity. And in monarchy, proximity is a kind of legitimacy. Courtiers didn't fear a mistress because she was seductive. That's the fairy tale version. Courtiers feared her because she was a pipeline. A pipeline through which her relatives could enter power. If the king loved her, he might give her brother a title. He might give her cousin a bishopric. He might give her father land. And suddenly, the mistress's family becomes a faction. A faction tied to the king's emotions. Which means the faction becomes untouchable. And that's how courts get destabilized. Not by romance. By appointments. By property. By influence. By who gets to whisper into the king's ear while he's tired, stressed, or angry. Now, medieval inheritance law didn't usually allow bastards to inherit the throne. But usually is not the same as never. Kings could legitimize children. Popes could grant dispensations. Nobles could be bribed into supporting someone. And armies could enforce any claim that had enough steel behind it. So when a mistress produced children, the question became, will the king treat them as secondary? Or as future royalty? And the moment the answer looked like future royalty, the queen's side began to panic. Because it meant the lawful heir could be replaced. Not legally, but practically. And medieval history is full of things that were not legal, but still happened. France, in particular, had a talent for this. Because French royal families were enormous. The nobility was powerful. And the kingdom was wealthy enough that everyone wanted a piece. So when the king had mistresses and bastards, those bastards didn't just become children. They became political assets, marriage tools, alliance tokens, military commanders, future threats. And the king, being a medieval king, often couldn't resist rewarding them. Not because he wanted them to be kings, but because he wanted to prove something. That his blood mattered. That his affection mattered. That he could elevate anyone he wanted. And nothing offended nobles more than a king proving he didn't need their permission. Here's the psychological horror for queens. A mistress could become a rival court. A rival household. A rival circle of nobles. A rival set of loyal servants. Sometimes even a rival religious patronage network. And she could do it without ever being crowned. Because her power came from intimacy. And intimacy is harder to challenge than law. You can argue with a queen's authority. You can't argue with the king's desire. Not safely. Medieval courts had a standard playbook for mistresses who became too powerful. Step 1. Destroy her reputation. Accuse her of witchcraft. Accuse her of greed. Accuse her of poisoning. Accuse her of seducing the king into bad decisions. Step 2. Separate her from the king. Send her away. Arrange her marriage. Exile her family. Isolate her politically. Step 3. If none of that works. Step 3. Eliminate her. Not always by execution. Sometimes by illness. Sometimes by accident. Sometimes by religious pressure. Sometimes by simply ensuring she had no allies left. But removal was always the goal. Because the court could tolerate scandal. It could not tolerate a parallel power structure. This is the part most people miss. When chroniclers called a mistress evil, it usually meant she succeeded. She gained land. She gained influence. She gained a faction. She got her children recognized. She got her relatives promoted. She got her enemies removed. And then she became the villain of the story. Because the people writing the story were the people she threatened. Medieval chroniclers were rarely neutral. They wrote from inside power structures. And power structures hated women who climbed without permission. This is where the role changes completely. Because the most dangerous mistress isn't the seductive one. It's the one who becomes a confidant, an advisor, a strategist, a gatekeeper, a political partner. A king can replace lust. But he struggles to replace trust. And once a mistress becomes the person he trusts, she becomes harder to dislodge than any minister. Because ministers can be dismissed. But the king's private loyalty? That's personal. And medieval kings were not famous for separating personal feelings from public policy. Because England gives us one of the clearest examples of this dynamic. A mistress who didn't just influence a king, but altered the entire political landscape. And her name is tied to one of the most famous medieval scandals in English history. Not because she was powerful alone, but because the king became weak through her. And the court blamed her for everything. Alice Purrs is one of those names that medieval England said the way people say mold or rats. Not because she led armies. Not because she poisoned princes. Not because she personally collapsed the kingdom with her bare hands. But because she did something far more offensive to medieval society. She became powerful in public. And she did it while being a king's mistress. Alice Purrs rose to prominence during the reign of Edward III, one of England's most celebrated warrior kings. A king who once embodied everything medieval England liked to imagine itself as. Strong, victorious, admired. A ruler whose early reign was defined by military success and confidence. Edward was the kind of king who made England feel like it mattered. But time did what time always does. Edward aged. His body weakened. His mind slowed. His political instincts dulled. And as the king's strength faded, the court began doing what courts always do. It began circling. Because a weak king is not a stable king. A weak king is a prize. The late years of Edward III's reign were messy. The economy was strained. The Black Death had devastated the population. War expenses were heavy. Parliament was increasingly assertive. Nobles were restless. Corruption was spreading. And the royal court, which had once been a center of chivalric confidence, was becoming a place of suspicion and faction. And into that environment stepped Alice Purrs. We don't know her exact origins with certainty, but she was not born into royal power. She was not a princess. She was not a high-ranking noblewoman. She appears to have entered the royal household as a lady-in-waiting, likely attached to Queen Philippa. And that's important. Because medieval courts were full of women like Alice. Women who served queens. Women who were educated enough to function in noble households. Women who understood etiquette, language, and social strategy. Women who were trained to be invisible. Alice was trained to be invisible. And she refused. At some point, Alice became Edward's mistress. But she didn't become the kind of mistress medieval people tolerated. She didn't stay quietly in the background. She didn't accept a few gifts and disappear when the king's mood shifted. She did what very few mistresses dared to do. She stayed. And she grew. And she began collecting power. Not the kind of power that comes with a crown. But the kind of power that comes with access. And access, in monarchy, is often more valuable than titles. Because the king's ear is the true throne. Alice Purrs had the king's ear. And once she had it, she began doing what all successful court figures did. She built a network. She secured land. She acquired wealth. She positioned allies. She negotiated favors. She involved herself in legal matters. She involved herself in appointments. She involved herself in disputes. And this is the point where medieval England stopped seeing her as a mistress and started seeing her as a threat. Because medieval society had no category for a woman like this. Queens were allowed influence because they were sacred. Noblewomen were allowed influence within their estates because that was domestic. Religious women were allowed influence because they were supposedly removed from politics. But a mistress? A mistress was supposed to be a secret. A private indulgence. A moral weakness. Not a public institution. Alice Purrs made herself public. And that made her unforgivable. Chroniclers accused her of greed. They accused her of corruption. They accused her of manipulating the king. They accused her of draining the royal treasury. They accused her of controlling legal cases. They accused her of using her position to enrich herself and her friends. And it's tempting to ask whether these accusations were true. Some of them probably were. But the more important question is this. Were the men around her doing the same things? And the answer, almost certainly, is yes. The late medieval court was full of corruption. Men used royal favor to gain land constantly. Men manipulated legal decisions constantly. Men accepted bribes constantly. Men used access to the king as currency constantly. But when men did it, it was called politics. When Alice did it, it was called evil. That is the pattern. And Alice Purrs became the perfect scapegoat. Because she represented everything the court wanted to blame for England's decline. A weakening king. A court full of corruption. A treasury under strain. And a country tired of war. Blaming the king was dangerous. Blaming the nobles was politically inconvenient. Blaming the government itself was too abstract. But blaming a woman, blaming the king's mistress, that was safe. That was satisfying. That was emotionally neat. Alice became the symbol of a decaying reign. Not because she caused it, but because she was visible during it. And medieval societies hated visible women. Especially women whose visibility came through the king's bedroom. One of the most famous accusations against Alice Pearse is that she sat beside Edward in court and influenced legal decisions. Whether she literally sat there or not, the fact that people believed it tells you everything. The image of a mistress sitting in judgment was unbearable. Because judgment was masculine. Authority was masculine. Law was masculine. A mistress was supposed to be temptation, not governance. Alice blurred that boundary. And medieval England responded the way it always responded when boundaries blurred. It punished the woman. In 1376, Parliament held what became known as the Good Parliament. This was one of the most significant parliamentary events of Edward III's reign. And it was, in many ways, a political reckoning. Parliament attacked corruption in the royal court. They demanded accountability. They challenged royal favorites. They forced the removal of certain officials. And they went after Alice Pearse directly. Because she was the most emotionally satisfying target. Parliament accused her of using her influence to interfere in the justice system. They accused her of acquiring wealth improperly. They accused her of corrupting the king. They accused her of draining resources. And then they did something unusual. They banished her. Not just from court. But from the king's presence. They legally forbade her from approaching him. And this is extraordinary. Because it shows that Parliament believed she had become a political actor. Not just a private companion. And it also shows something else. They believed Edward was too weak to remove her himself. So the kingdom stepped in. This is what happens when a king becomes fragile. His household stops being personal. It becomes national. Alice Pearse was removed. Her wealth was targeted. Her reputation was destroyed. And for a brief moment, it looked like England had solved its problem. The mistress was gone. The corruption was punished. The court was purified. The kingdom was saved. Except it wasn't. Because the real issue wasn't Alice Pearse. The real issue was that Edward III was dying. And a dying king creates panic. Because the question becomes, what comes next? Edward's heir, the Black Prince, had already died. So the next king would be Richard II, a child. And a child king is an invitation to chaos. A regency. Factional power struggles. Noble ambition. The same pattern, repeating. And in that moment of instability, Alice Pearse returned. Because she understood something. Banishment is only permanent when the people enforcing it remain strong. And the court was not strong. It was divided. Edward's health was failing. The old guard was fading. And in the confusion, Alice slipped back into the king's orbit. Like a shadow returning to a dying flame. She was with Edward in his final days. And when he died in 1377, the political backlash hit again. Alice was removed once more. Her property was seized. Her name was dragged through official records. She was blamed for the decline of the reign. And she was turned into a moral lesson. The danger of women. The danger of lust. The danger of letting a king become weak. But here's the part medieval chroniclers did not want to admit. Alice survived. She didn't become a queen. She didn't become a saint. She didn't become a martyr. She became something much rarer in medieval history. She became a woman who played the court's game. And lived. Even after disgrace. Even after banishment. Even after Parliament tried to erase her. Alice Pearse lived into old age. She fought legal battles. She retained some wealth. She navigated the system. And she died not in a dungeon, not in exile, not in execution. She died as a woman who had once been one of the most powerful figures in England. And that is why she was remembered as evil. Not because she was uniquely corrupt. But because she proved something medieval society could not tolerate. That a woman could rise through intimacy, survive through strategy, and outlast the men who tried to destroy her. Alice Purrs is not the story of a mistress destroying a king. She is the story of a kingdom refusing to admit its king was failing. So it blamed the woman closest to him. And that pattern repeats again and again. Across Europe. Across centuries. Whenever a ruler weakens, the people around him look for a convenient villain. And in medieval courts, the easiest villain was always the woman. Because a woman could be blamed without challenging the legitimacy of the crown. Blaming Alice Purrs allowed England to keep believing in Edward III. Even while his reign decayed. And that is the real function of the evil mistress in medieval history. Not to cause chaos. But to carry the blame for chaos that was already there. Because kings could not be criticized too openly. Governments could not be condemned too directly. But mistresses? Mistresses were safe targets. They could be condemned without destabilizing the ideology of monarchy itself. And that is why history is full of evil mistresses. Not because they were uniquely wicked. But because they were uniquely convenient. And now, if England gives us the scapegoat mistress, France gives us something even more dangerous. The mistress who becomes so normal, so expected, so institutional. That the court stops pretending she is a scandal at all. Instead, she becomes part of the system. A public role. A recognized power. A second queen without the crown. And that evolution begins long before the famous names people usually remember. It begins when kings and courts quietly accept one uncomfortable truth. A queen gives legitimacy. But a mistress gives control. And control is what monarchs crave most. By the late medieval period, Europe had quietly developed something like an unofficial government office. It wasn't written into law. It wasn't announced in public. It wasn't blessed by the church. But everyone knew it existed. The king's mistress had become a political position. Not in theory. In practice. And the reason was simple. Monarchy is not just power. Monarchy is access. And the mistress controlled access in the most intimate way possible. A minister could be replaced. A noble could be exiled. A bishop could be ignored. But the woman the king trusted at night? That was harder. Because she wasn't just a political connection. She was emotional infrastructure. And medieval kings, for all their armor and banners, were still human beings. Which is why courts feared mistresses more than they feared most generals. Because generals could be fought. Mistresses couldn't. Not directly. If you challenged the mistress, you risked angering the king. If you ignored her, you risked losing influence. If you tried to remove her, you risked making her a martyr. So instead, courts adapted. They learned to negotiate with mistresses. They learned to flatter them. They learned to bribe them. They learned to make alliances with them. And this is the moment the mistress stops being a scandal. And becomes a gate. A gate that everyone must pass through. And gates always collect tolls. Not always money. Sometimes favors. Sometimes marriages. Sometimes land. Sometimes legal protection. Sometimes the survival of your career. And once the mistress becomes the gate, she becomes the court's shadow queen. Which brings us to one of the most important truths about medieval politics. A queen ruled by legitimacy. A mistress ruled by leverage. Legitimacy is slow. It comes from bloodlines, religion, law, ceremony. Leverage is immediate. Leverage comes from being able to say one sentence into the king's ear while everyone else is waiting outside. Leverage comes from timing. From mood. From vulnerability. And kings, despite their public authority, were often deeply vulnerable. They were pressured. They were surrounded by ambitious men. They were trapped in dynastic expectations. They were constantly watched. They were constantly judged. And they were rarely allowed to be human. A mistress offered something the queen often couldn't. Not because queens weren't capable, but because queens were symbolic. Queens were public. Queens were political by default. Every word a queen said could be interpreted as policy. Every gesture could be turned into rumor. Every favor could become a faction. Queens were under permanent scrutiny. A mistress, on the other hand, existed in the private world. And the private world is where kings often made their real decisions. Because in public, kings performed. In private, kings confessed. In private, kings panicked. In private, kings admitted weakness. In private, kings revealed who they actually feared. And the person who witnessed that private self had power. Not official power, but psychological power. And psychological power is the kind that can shape kingdoms. This is why mistresses could become more influential than queens. Not because they were more legitimate, but because they were closer to the king's real mind. Now, medieval chroniclers hated admitting this. So they wrote about mistresses in a specific way. They described them as seductresses, as witches, as temptresses, as corrupters. Because describing a mistress as politically intelligent would require admitting the king was politically weak. And medieval society could not tolerate the idea of a king being emotionally influenced. A king was supposed to be rational, divinely appointed, firm, stable. But the reality was that kings were often deeply human. And humans are influenceable. So chroniclers created a narrative. The mistress is evil. The king is the victim. The kingdom suffers. The moral lesson is clear. Women are dangerous. Lust is dangerous. Virtue is required. This narrative protected monarchy. It protected the idea of kingship. Because it shifted blame away from the king's weakness and onto the woman who benefited from it. And this is why so many mistresses are remembered as villains. Not because they were uniquely wicked, but because they were uniquely close to power. And proximity to power is always punished in the historical record when it belongs to the wrong person. Now, in France, this dynamic became almost routine. French courts, especially in the late medieval and early Renaissance period, were already deeply factional. Nobles competed constantly. Families formed alliances like spider webs. The king was the center of that web. And the mistress became the second center. A second gravitational force. And this is where the role becomes terrifying. Because once the mistress becomes a center of gravity, she starts doing what any center of gravity does. She pulls. She pulls appointments toward her allies. She pulls wealth toward her household. She pulls access toward her friends. She pulls influence away from rivals. And she pulls the king's attention toward her priorities. Sometimes those priorities were selfish. Sometimes they were political. Sometimes they were simply survival. But they always had consequences. And in a medieval court, consequences often meant people dying. Not always through assassination. Sometimes through political death. Exile. Disgrace. Financial ruin. Loss of titles. Loss of protection. And those forms of death were sometimes worse. Because medieval nobles did not fear pain as much as they feared irrelevance. A mistress could make you irrelevant. And that was a kind of execution. Now, here's where the role of the mistress becomes even more complex. Because not all mistresses were parasites. Some were stabilizers. Some were actually competent. Some understood politics better than the king did. Some acted as advisors. Some protected the king from reckless nobles. Some prevented wars. Some encouraged diplomacy. Some supported religious institutions. Some funded art and architecture. Some built charitable networks. Some tried to be loved by the people. And when they did those things, the court hated them even more. Because a mistress who is merely greedy is predictable. You can bribe her. You can bargain with her. You can wait for her downfall. But a mistress who is competent. A mistress who governs quietly. A mistress who understands statecraft. That is the nightmare. Because it means she is not just a symptom of royal weakness. She is a political actor. And medieval courts did not like women acting politically unless they were queens. And even queens were only tolerated when they acted in specific, approved ways. This is why queens and mistresses often existed in a strange state of mutual hostility. Not always personally. Sometimes queens and mistresses were not enemies at all. Sometimes they tolerated each other. Sometimes they negotiated. Sometimes they coexisted. Because both understood something. The king was the unstable variable. And the king's instability could destroy both of them. A queen could lose her status if she offended him. A mistress could lose her life if she threatened the dynasty. Both were vulnerable. But only one had legal protection. And only one had emotional access. So they existed in parallel. Two women orbiting the same man, in a system designed to make them rivals. And the system benefited from that rivalry. Because as long as women were fighting each other, men remained in control. That is the oldest trick in court politics. Now, at this point in the story, we need to address something that medieval history often hides behind moral language. The reason mistresses became powerful is because medieval monarchy was not a modern institution. It wasn't bureaucratic. It wasn't systematic. It didn't run on rules. It ran on people. On moods. On loyalty. On access. On favors. On relationships. And relationships are messy. So the king's private life was never private. Not truly. It was a political engine. And the mistress sat at the center of that engine. Which brings us to the next type of mistress. The type that changes everything. The mistress who doesn't just gain wealth. Doesn't just gain influence. Doesn't just build a faction. But begins to reshape the dynasty itself. Because once a mistress becomes the king's long-term partner. And once she begins producing children. And once the king begins favoring those children. You no longer have a court scandal. You have a succession threat. And succession threats in medieval Europe did not end with gossip. They ended with blood. So now we move into the most explosive category of all. The mistress whose children become claimants. The mistress whose love affair becomes a civil war waiting to happen. And to see that dynamic at its most brutal, we need to go to a kingdom that was basically built on succession disasters. A kingdom where the crown was always unstable. A kingdom where nobles treated royal weakness like an invitation. A kingdom where one king's romantic decisions could set the entire country on fire. We need to go to England again. Because England, more than almost any other medieval kingdom, demonstrates one repeating truth. When the crown is fragile, the mistress becomes dangerous. Not because she wants to be, but because everyone around her starts projecting fear onto her. Fear of illegitimacy. Fear of betrayal. Fear of foreign influence. Fear of the wrong child inheriting. Fear of civil war. And those fears turn into action. And that action turns into legend. So the next story is not just about a mistress. It's about a woman who became the mother of a dynasty. A woman whose relationship with a king helped create one of the most famous royal lines in English history. And a woman who was condemned for centuries, not because she failed, but because she succeeded. Her name is Catherine Swynford. And her story is one of the strangest, most consequential love affairs of the medieval world. Because it didn't just produce scandal. It produced a bloodline that would eventually take the throne. And that is the kind of thing medieval history never forgives.